Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Another video on the Canon R5 Mark II. This time, it's all about the autofocus. And we're going to talk about setup of the autofocus, go through the menus, show you how I set it up, give you some options for doing certain things different ways, which is one of the great things about these cameras now is they're so flexible when it comes to setup. We're going to talk about some refinements that I'm seeing in the autofocus system of the R5 Mark II over the R3 and over the R5 for sure. We're going to be out in the field trying to get some footage of the behavior of the autofocus system in this camera, birds in flight. Now, I'll tell you, that's what I'm doing right now, to be honest. And it's difficult because I have to track birds looking at the external recorder that's hooked up to the camera. So we'll see how that turns out, but hopefully I should get some footage that'll show you kind of how it behaves, birds in flight, flying against backgrounds, things like that. So if you're interested in the autofocus system of the R5 Mark II, stay tuned. Okay, so we're out of the field, back in my studio, and I was out there trying to get some footage of some birds in flight using my external recorder and tracking birds so I could show you the behavior of the autofocus system of the Canon R5 Mark II. We'll see how well we did there, but before we get into that, I want to go into the menus, set up the menus for birds and birds in flight. And then I want to do some static work, show you the behavior of the autofocus system, my three buttons, my three back button setup for the autofocus for the Canon R5 Mark II. And then we'll get into the action type stuff and we'll look at the behavior there. So, kind of, like I said in the beginning, all about the autofocus system of this camera. So without further ado, let's hop into the menu. So here we go. Autofocus operation on the first tab of the autofocus menu is set to servo. The option here, AI focus and one shot. One shot, don't really have a use for it, don't really need it for me, for my setup, because back button autofocus really allows you to shoot one shot almost like it was set up that way, just by pushing the button or letting off the back button. So don't need to really go there. AI focus, artificial intelligent focus, interesting option in that if you set this, you allow the camera to determine where to go with the focus setting. One shot kind of behavior versus servo behavior. If the animal or bird or person or subject in general is not moving further away or closer to you, basically static, it's going to function like one shot. If it senses more movement, subject's moving away, coming closer to you, it's going to function more in servo. I just like to set it in servo. I've tried AI focus. I don't think it reacts fast enough to what's the changes that are happening with how the subject is behaving. So like I said, I set it to servo, and we go from there using back buttons, pressing, letting go of the back buttons to react to what the subject is doing. All right, autofocus area. I have this set up. There's a menu further down the line where you can have different autofocus areas set up for different orientations of the camera. Here I have that set up for when it's a landscape orientation, it uses zone 1, and when it's in the portrait orientation, either way, it goes to and uses zone 3. and we can get out and see what actually happens. Now, I'm tilting the camera, and you can see what it's doing. This is landscape. This is portrait. Of course, the recorder that I'm recording this on isn't shifting its orientation, but you can see what I did is that when it's in portrait, it's a longer zone than when it's in landscape, and that just suits the shooting scenario best, I think, for when you have the camera in those different orientations. You can have the same autofocus area set for all orientations, and we'll get to that menu here in a minute. Whole area tracking servo autofocus. I have this set to off in the main autofocus menu, but I have whole area tracking servo autofocus set up on my set button. We'll get to that, but you can see right now I've gone into, and we're in the shooting mode now, and I'm on zone 1, but if I press the set button, oh, there you go. It goes into full area tracking. It's looking for an eye or a subject right now of the eye of a subject, but there's nothing there. It's just black. I keep it this way just because it's easier to see what's happening on the screen. So anyway, that's how I have set up my whole area tracking autofocus. I don't want it on all the time. I prefer to have it off so that my zone type autofocus, which I use most of the time, doesn't have the behavior of, once it gets a subject, switching to whole area. I only want to switch to whole area when I want to do it, and having it set to the set button is the way I do that. Focus mode, yeah, autofocus. This, if you happen to have a lens that doesn't have a manual focus autofocus switch on it, this is where you can potentially go in and switch the focus modes for that lens. It just depends on what lens you put on the camera. Moving on to the next tab, subject to detect, I have set to animals because that's what I shoot most of the time. But not all of the time. Sometimes I'm shooting animals and something will be happening out there with some people involved, and maybe I want to switch to that. So how do I have that set up? Well, I use two principal lenses for my photography, my 200 to 800 RF and my 600 f4 RF. And so we can go into shooting mode again. And on both of those lenses, there are buttons, the lens buttons. And I have those buttons set up to toggle between the type of subject. And I just have two, animals and people. And you can see that happening here as I'm pressing the button on the lens. It's changing my subject type. We're going to keep it in animals. That's how I switch subject to detect quickly. Like I said, it's so flexible now where you can go in and set, there's so many buttons available, and the buttons that I have selected, and we'll get into the whole customized buttons thing here in a minute, you can set it up how you like. I'm using buttons that fall where I can easily get to them, where I have muscle memory. You may be completely different, of course, but the whole point is there's probably a button that you can set up to do these different things that you want to do, have them in a spot where you want them. So, eye detection, I have set to auto. Well, let's go back up to subject to detect. There's a bunch of things in here. There's auto, and there's animals and people and vehicles and none. I have this restricted to just people and animals because that's generally what I do. I don't want to have to cycle with that button through a bunch of different things. If I want to quickly switch peoples and animals, it's people and animals, it's really easy to do. All right, so eye detection I have set to auto. This principally means right, left doesn't matter to me. I mean, when you're shooting animals and birds, I don't care, and I'm pretty sure you don't care. which eye the autofocus grabs. If you're doing people, maybe you do. And if you're using very, very shallow depth of field lenses, if you're shooting people, it may matter which eye it picks. But for me, it really doesn't. And so I have it set to auto. And so it just picks whatever eye it wants on the subject. But I think it actually does more than that, this setting. It seems to, when I turn it off and I turn it on. It seems to also keep the eye detection. If you disable this, it doesn't really look for an eye. If you put it on auto, it looks for an eye and then a head and then a body more. So I think there's more to it than just auto pick of the left or right eye. I think it kind of auto selects whether it's even going to go for an eye. If it finds an eye, it goes for one. If it doesn't see an eye in what it's looking at as far as trying to get autofocus, the autofocus doesn't even try. It just goes to head or body or wing flapping. If I'm in zone, I think the algorithm, it has movement built into it. So this, I think having it set to auto has worked really well for me. So I'm keeping it on that for now. Register people priority. I'm not doing that. I don't shoot people. I shoot birds, wildlife. I have a button set to go to people, but that's a rare occurrence, really. So I'm not going to register people's faces and things, but you can do that. You can turn it on and you can photograph people and register them. You can register people from an image on a card, all this different kind of stuff. So you can even save and load registered data from a card onto a card and then put it back on from a card and all that kind of stuff. So it's really a pretty in-depth capability in this camera, but for me it really doesn't apply to what I do, so I have not set any of this up. Action priority, if you go in here, this is for sports, you can set it up for different sports, soccer and basketball, volleyball. Right now I think those are the three. It won't let me right now because I don't have it in people, I have it in animals. I go up here, put it in people. Now you can come down here and you can do the different sporting events like I just said. But it's still disabled, and I'm going to leave it that way. And of course I'm going to go back up here and go back to animals here. So anyway, not something that I've set up, but it's there for you. This is an important setting for autofocus, at least in my mind, in that there used to be a bunch of cases in here. Case 1, Case 2, Case 3, Case 4, and they were really just bins to store different settings for, it started out with 3 parameters. There was switching track subjects, tracking sensitivity, and XL decel tracking, and then it went to 2, took the whole switching track subjects out, and now we don't even have cases anymore. You could set up the different cases for different types of photography. Action photography versus, more static type stuff. They've dumbed it down now. I'm just going to say that, dumbed it down, whatever. Reduced our options, which sometimes is not a bad thing. Reduces complexity to either picking auto or manual. I have it set to auto. If you go to manual, it's kind of like a case, but you only have one case now. And you can set the tracking sensitivity and the XL decel tracking if you pick manual. Let's pick manual, and then let's go ahead and hit the rate button, and we can go into tracking sensitivity, and we can go locked on there, because that's the way I like my tracking sensitivity to behave. I shoot a lot of birds in flight, and they go behind things and things go in front of them as they're flying, my subject. So once I'm locked on the bird, I don't want it to come off the bird when distracting things come into the frame. And this will help you there. You can set this also in the auto, and we'll get back to that. But be aware that if you go with locked on for tracking sensitivity, either here or in the auto, that's this back here. If you go to auto, let's get out of there. If you go to auto, you have a case auto. The characteristic of how the auto case behaves, if you have it set the way I have it set here in negative, it's the same pretty much as having the tracking sensitivity in here set to locked on. Let's go ahead and set it to locked on. If you do that, if you're using back button or half press and the autofocus misses the subject, and you just continue to hold the button down, by having this setting to locked on, it did lock on something, just not your subject. If you just hold the button down waiting for the camera to try to refocus again, you're going to be waiting a long time. If you go and do the tracking sensitivity, you put it up to the positive side, then if you miss or it misses, the autofocus misses the subject, and you just continue to hold the button down, it's going to retry much quicker when you get on the subject again, let's say in the zone. So you just got to figure out how you want to approach this. For me, I have it set to locked on, and if I miss, I pump the back button and I say try again, try again, try again. I just don't hold it down waiting for the camera to retry. I make it retry by what I call pumping the back button until it grabs the subject, and then I hold it and I shoot. So it just depends on how you want the autofocus to behave when it comes to grabbing a new subject, let's say. If you do the tracking sensitivity on the positive side, the reactive side, either in the auto selection here or in the manual selection, be aware that it may switch off your subject when you don't want to, even when you have it locked into the subject, even when the autofocus has grabbed the actual subject that you want it to. So you just have to play around with the behavior here and find out how you like to have it set. I personally, if I'm going to be in manual, I would have the tracking sensitivity set the way it is, and I would have XL decel tracking set all the way to the positive. What is XL decel tracking? Well, it reacts differently to something that is starting and stopping really quickly. And if you are accelerating and you're going with something that's moving really fast and then it stops and you overplay a little bit and keep going but then get back, it's not going to switch off of the subject as quickly if you have the XL decel tracking set to the positive side. If you have it set to the negative side, it will do more of that kind of switching quicker. So if I'm going to set this up, if I was going to use the manual case, this is how I would have it set up. This is very similar. This is exactly how I had my other Canon cameras set up for tracking sensitivity and XL decel tracking. In auto, and this is what I use, it only has one thing that you can change. Hit the rate button, and it's the lockdown versus responsive, and I go to the negative side for the same reasons I just talked about. I like to be on auto because what the auto does is it senses changes in what you're doing. These cameras have accelerometers and gyros and stuff in them, so they know how fast you're panning, if you're going up, down, left, right, all that kind of stuff. So when it senses a change, it will change, especially in this case, the XL decel behavior of the autofocus if you're in auto, whereas if you're in manual, it won't, because you have it set to something specific. So I like the auto setting. Ever since auto settings came into this autofocus system of Canon cameras, I've gone to the auto setup, and I like the behavior, so I've basically stayed there. All right, well, that was a lot to talk about there, but I think it's important. It really does make a difference in how the autofocus behaves. Next tab over, first image priority for servo autofocus, I want it to release. I don't want to have it on focus, because if the camera thinks that your subject is out of focus, whatever it thinks is the subject, and you try to shoot, it's not going to shoot. The camera's not going to take any pictures. That completely throws me off my game. I don't like that. When I press the shutter button down, I want it to shoot, whether the camera thinks my subject's in focus or not. One shot autofocus release priority, I don't care. I just have it set to focus, because if it's a one shot thing, then get it in focus. I just never shoot one shot, so it's really not of any kind of bearing on what I do and what I want as far as the behavior of the autofocus system to be. Preview autofocus, I would keep this disabled if I were you. This terminology here I think is poor by Canon. It should really say continuous autofocus, because that's what this does. If you turn this on, if you enable this, your lens, your camera, is going to be focusing continuously. And it doesn't matter if you're pressing half press or if you're pressing a back button, depending on how you have your autofocus initiation set up on your camera, it's just going to be focusing all the time. And I don't find that to be helpful at all. I find it to be a big hindrance, actually, for what I do with my bird photography, so I keep that disabled. Lens drive, when autofocus is impossible, that's the cycling thing. If it misses your subject, you want it to try again. And so I have this turned on rather than turning it off. You can go to info help a lot of times, and it'll tell you what these things do in some of these menu items, specifically the lens operation when focus could not be achieved. Continue focus search. That's what we want. When focus could not be achieved, the lens drive keeps operating to find the focus position. It's not recommended for use with super telephoto lenses for some reason. I'm not sure why. Stop focus search, that stops driving the lens after autofocus fails, recommended with super telephoto lenses to avoid lengthy focus searching. I don't know. I disagree with that. I like it to search. These cameras, these mirrorless cameras now, they do a lot less searching, I find, than the digital SLRs used to do. And that's good and bad, actually. I just find you have to pump the back button a lot more with mirrorless cameras to get it to retry in the first place and do this whole, searching thing that we're talking about. So I just leave that on. I think it helps a little bit. It definitely doesn't hurt anything that I've seen. Autofocus assist beam, if you're shooting very low light, you can have the camera send out an assist beam to help the autofocus focus, and it works. I don't shoot in those situations much, shooting birds in flight, long distance type things. This focus beam firing, the assist beam firing, isn't going to help you much. So I keep it off for this type of photography. Limit your autofocus areas. Yeah, I did limit mine. There are certain ones I just don't use, principally the expanded autofocus area, the other choice of expanded autofocus area. I don't go to full area autofocus. If I go to full area, it's because I'm shooting eye detection or I actually hit my set button, like I said before, to get to whole area autofocus. So I'm just keeping that turned off so I don't have to cycle through it. Let's talk about these down here with the lock symbols in them. These are new, and I have one of them turned on, principally because I was demonstrating something to somebody. And what they do is they provide you with a quick way to go to a locked autofocus area, in the sense that it goes to the middle of the frame, there's no tracking involved, it turns off tracking, and it turns off any type of subject priority. And so you could set this up to cycle to it, or set this up on a button, back button, let's say, and it's a quick way to get out of all the tracking stuff. And if we're shooting animals or vehicles and you just don't want it to look for anything in particular, you just want it to look for a subject based on the closest thing in the frame, let's say, you can go and initiate one of these locked autofocus areas. And I get it. I can see the value of these, but I can also see that I can get the same thing with just a regular spot autofocus if I have whole area tracking turned off. And let's say if I initiate it or set it up through my custom buttons to one of my back buttons, I can tell that setup, and we're going to get to that setup in a minute, not to use any sort of subject or any sort of tracking. So that, like I said earlier, there's multiple ways you can do or achieve the same thing, the same type of behavior with the autofocus in this camera and a lot of cameras now. So it just depends on how you want to do this. And when we get over to setting up the buttons, the back buttons, I will talk more about the different options for setting up something that behaves exactly the same. Linked orientation for your autofocus point in here, and you see I have separate autofocus points, and not only a different area and point. Okay, you can have points only, but I do the separate area and point. So that is what is reflected way back here when it looks like that. Now if we go back and we turn that off and go to same for both vertical and horizontal, and we go back here, now you can see there's no orientation available. You just pick your autofocus area and it's represented in the autofocus area part of this menu. So it just depends on if you want the camera to change and use a different autofocus point or area when you flip the orientation of the camera. I find it useful. So I have this turned on so that when I flip my camera, it uses different autofocus areas or points. All right, so that's where that's set up. Limit subject to detect. I already talked about it. I just do people and animals. And so when I hit that button I have set up, the lens button, the lens multifunction button, it's L-MN in your buttons menu, and we'll customize buttons menu, and we'll get to that. I just have 2 to cycle through, and that works for me. Left and right eye detection. I've got them all turned on, so they were all available to me in the past menu that we went through earlier and talked about being able to select auto for eye detection or left, right eye, or turn it off. I'm leaving those all on for now. I may end up turning some of these off, but I don't know why I would. It's fine the way it is, it seems. These are all manual focus settings in here. So if you go to manual focus, which sometimes you need to do, and in other sections of this video, we're going to talk about how this autofocus in the R5 Mark II is more refined than in past Canon cameras, even the R3, definitely more refined than the R5, the original R5, but we'll see where manual focus, switching to that, can be important. And having some aids turned on, like peaking or the focus guides, can help you make sure that when you are manually focusing, your subject is what's in focus. All right, so the last tab in the actual autofocus menu, this is kind of cool. For a long time now, it seems, we've been able to take all of our settings on our camera and save them to a card and put it aside, and then if you have to do something like send your camera into Canon and they reset everything, you get it back, you can just reload all your settings, or at least most of them. Here, this is a register and recall autofocus related settings, which I think is pretty cool. You can set up your autofocus for birds in flight, let's say, and then register it to one of these bins, like the top one there that I have RRB, default, DEF, and then you could set one up for portraits, set one up for landscape, whatever, whatever. And you can set them all to, you can register or save them all to a different set, to a different bin, and then reload them by going to recall. So I think that's a cool addition. They even have a QR code that you can scan and get into the autofocus setting guide online. So, but what do you need that for? You've got my video. Anyway, so that's the autofocus menu and how I have it set up. And we'll see how changing these things, some of these settings, actually affects the performance of the autofocus in the field. It's difficult to demonstrate a lot of this in the field because you have to use an external recorder to show what the camera's seeing, and you can't look through the viewfinder and shoot like you normally would. I'll do the best I can, and we'll see how it goes, but hopefully you can see what some of these settings actually do and why I have them set the way I have them set for my bird and flight photography. Now, having said that, let's keep going. We're going to go over to the what's called now the customized control menu, I guess. And the main two are these top ones, customize buttons for shooting and customize dials and controls, the control ring, I mean. So let's go into the buttons, and you can see how I have my autofocus system set up. Well, the first one is the shutter button half press setting, and you can see I don't have autofocus set up on that at all. All I have there is metering start. So when I half press my shutter button, all I get is metering start, no autofocus related performance at all. We move down to the autofocus on button. Now, talked about using back button. There's 3 back buttons. There's the autofocus on button, the asterisk button, and the autofocus point button. Those are the 3 from left to right, and I have each one of those set up to do a different autofocus area or behavior. And that is one of the most powerful things that shooting a Canon camera gives you over other cameras. You have 3 buttons lined up where all you have to do is move your thumb, and you can move your thumb really fast, so instantly you can change the autofocus area or behavior of your autofocus system, and that gets you more shots when you're doing action type photography like I do a lot of. Autofocus on button is set up for metering and autofocus start, so it's going to use whatever autofocus area I have set up in the main autofocus area menu back here. And it's going to use whichever orientation I have the camera in. So let's just say I'm shooting in landscape orientation of the camera like I normally do most of the time, and I hit my autofocus on button, it's going to use flexible zone 1. If I do flip the camera and I hit the autofocus on button, it's going to use flexible zone 3. The asterisk button is set up for the direct link to eye detection autofocus. That's set up in here. It has nothing to do, that's why I can have eye detection turned off if I wanted to. In the main menu, the main autofocus menu, this overrides that. This goes to a direct link to eye autofocus. You can see it's right there in blue. So that's what this AE lock button, the asterisk button, is set up to do. Direct link to eye autofocus, which will look for an eye and then track that bird or whatever subject it's locked onto the eye of throughout the entire frame. The autofocus point button, I have it set up to do register and recall a shooting function. Now, we talked about those locked autofocus areas just a few minutes ago. In here, once you have this button set to register and recall a shooting function, you can hit the info button and go into the detail set. This is where you can set up what pressing and holding the register or the autofocus point button will do. And by putting a check mark, just for an example, in the shooting mode, if I set it up this way and I press the button, the autofocus point button, it's going to use the P shooting mode, the program mode. If I take it out, if I take the check mark away, it's not going to use that. So you can see I only have a check mark in autofocus area and in autofocus operation. And so you can set up your autofocus to be like that locked version, let's say the locked version of the spot autofocus, which again, for review, gives you the spot autofocus in the center of the frame with no subject being a priority. I mean, it doesn't, not animals, not people, not cars, just look for something. Whatever that spot is on, basically, that spot autofocus point is on, that's what you're going to focus on. That's what you're telling the autofocus system. So I can get that same performance as that locked spot autofocus option by just turning on, by putting a check mark in the box for autofocus area and having the autofocus area set to spot, and going down and keeping whole area tracking not checked, subject to detect not checked, eye detection not checked, all these things, and then just having the autofocus operation on. So now what will happen is when I press the button, you get spot autofocus in the center of the frame, and it won't switch to tracking when it goes on to a subject. So it's just like that spot locked autofocus area option that Canon added. This is just one example of being able to get the same autofocus behavior or performance two different ways. So let's go back in there. Let's go back in here, and I could go down to this button, and I could go in here, and I could set this to that. It's going to get, it's the same thing, except I could turn a bunch of other stuff on, and like whole frame autofocus tracking, whole frame tracking, and it wouldn't use it because it's the locked version of this. But why do that in here, right? Doesn't make any sense when you can just go to it directly. So again, there's just multiple ways you can do the same thing. This is the way I have it set up. This is the way I have my R3 set up. This is the way I have my R5 set up. So why change it? It works for me. But the whole point of this is to show you that there's multiple ways that you can achieve the same thing. With these cameras nowadays, you got so much flexibility in setup. It really is nice to have all these options. The one thing you don't want to do is to go down and hit register current settings once you have this register and recall shooting function set up the way you want it, because what that will do is register basically all the settings that have to do with any of these items in here, like shooting mode and shutter speed and all that. It's going to set those in here if you hit that and turn them on, and you don't want that. So don't hit register current settings unless that's what you actually want to do. Let's get out of here, and we'll go one more down, and I have my depth of field button set up for something that isn't autofocus related. So I'm not going to really go into that other than to say it changes to shooting mode from H+ to H. But the set button, like I said earlier, I have that set up to start and stop my whole area tracking. So if I'm doing something and I want whole area tracking, and I'm in one of my 3 buttons is set up to not do whole area tracking in any way, shape, or form, all I have to do is hit my set button, and it goes to whole area tracking, just like that. So that's the way I have that set up to get to that quickly. The next button down is your multi-controller, your little thumb joystick there. I have that set for direct autofocus point control, so that if I'm in here and I want to move this around, all I do is hit the joystick and I can move it wherever I want. If I want to be up more toward the top because I want to try to get wing beats down and it's a bird with long wings and I don't want to be cutting them off, the bird's big in the frame, that kind of thing. That's why I could easily just put it up there, or I could go the opposite way for wings up down here. Like if I'm shooting skimming swallowtail kites where they're drinking on the water, I will move my zone toward the bottom because when they skim, their wings are up. And if that bird is really close, I may want to favor having my autofocus zone down toward the bottom. To get it back to the center of the frame, just press the multi-controller in, straight in, and it puts it back in the center of the frame, and it puts that dot in the middle to tell you it's in the center of the frame, which I think is a nice thing. If we move down one more button, LFN, lens function. I think I said MN earlier. It's L-FM, lens function. And I have that set, like I showed you earlier, to cycle the type of subject. Animals, people, animals, people. Don't use it much, but if I need to go to people real quick and it matters, but animals includes people now in its definition, in its algorithm, not like before, but still, I think it'll do a better job if you're shooting people to be on people than to be in animals, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have people. They just have animals, because I guess people are animals in a way. So anyway, that's the way I have it set up. It's kind of weird now the way Canon does it. And that's it. That's the buttons set up. We can go to dials. It has nothing really to do with the autofocus until you get to my control ring. If I have a camera with a control ring on it, like my 200 to 800, I have that set up to quickly change autofocus areas. That's really it for the menu setup for autofocus in the Canon R5 Mark II. So let's talk next about the flexible autofocus zone system of the R5 Mark II, something the R5 did not have. The R3 has it, so I've been using it for a while, and I love it, and I'm so glad, and I knew they would, bring it to the R5 Mark II. So let's talk first about the flexible nature of these zones. You can change the size of them. There are 3 flexible zones, 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that on zone 1, this is the size and shape that I have it. If we go to zone 2, now I pressed the multifunction button to get into this menu and used the thumb wheel to scroll over to zone 2 and pick zone 2, you can see it's a little bit bigger. And if we do that again and go in and go to zone 3, now it's much bigger. And that's how I have my zone set up. Go back to zone 1 and go into shooting mode, and I will flip my camera to the vertical orientation, and you'll see that it changes to zone 3, because when I'm shooting in vertical, generally I'm shooting a static subject. I'm not shooting in vertical very often for birds in flight, and I want a larger zone coverage that gives me the flexibility to get the composition in camera that I want for my vertical shots. If I go back to horizontal or landscape format, it goes back to zone 1. Now, I showed you just a second ago my zone 2 size, which is a little bit bigger than zone 1, but it's very, very similar in size. So let's say we want to change this to be a little bit bigger than zone 1, but a little bit smaller than zone 3. How do we do that? Well, we go and I use the Q button on the back of the camera. When you're in the shooting mode like you're in now, you hit the Q button and you can see that autofocus area. Underneath that they have set and info. Let's hit the set button, and now you're into a situation where you can use the main dial up by the shutter button to broaden it, and you can use the thumb wheel to change the height of it. So let's go here for zone 2. And so hit set, and then we can get out of here, go back into the shooting mode. So now if we look at it, we've got zone 1, we've got zone 2, and then we've got zone 3. Now let's make that one even a little bit bigger. Again, hit the Q button, and we're going to bring it to the set button, and then we're going to make that a little bit wider and one click taller, and hit the set button to register that, and then we can go back. There we go. So there's 3, 2, and 1. And I shoot 1 most of the time. I'm shooting birds in flight a lot, action photography a lot. I like the size of this zone for shooting action. Shooting a zone, of course, excludes a lot of the background, helps your autofocus system figure out what your subject is, and then track it within that zone once it locks onto it. And I really like shooting in zone. Zone brings in different algorithms than eye detection does. And so zone algorithms have things like movement. They're looking for wing flaps and things like that. Eye detection, the first priority there obviously is eyes, looking for an eye. So I really like shooting in zone with eye detection turned on sometimes. If I think the eye is going to be critical when the bird gets really close, chances of the bird getting really close, or sometimes I'll turn eye detection off, and then that way I have a pure zone, I call it. It'll find the head and the body within the zone, and that's for really challenging situations like really cluttered backgrounds that the bird blends in well with, things like that. So there you go. There's the flexible zone system of the Canon R5 Mark II, something I like. I think it really makes the autofocus system of this camera and all the other cameras that have the flexible zone system so great. All right, so now we're going to look at autofocus behavior with the settings we just went over in the menu system. I'm using my carved bird because, of course, trying to do this with real birds would be almost impossible to ever get this kind of footage. So we're going to do it in a somewhat of a artificial way, but very realistic. My settings are ISO 8000 at 1/250th of a second at 7:1. This is a challenging situation. Now let's back out a little bit. I was at about 400 millimeters. Now we're at 200 millimeters. Go up here, let's say, go to the background. Okay, now it's way out of focus. Now you come in here, you put the center of the frame on there, and You hit spot, and it goes right to it. If you would come up here, way out of focus, and come down here and just try to use eye detection, it finds the wing. There, it did find the bird. Bird's in focus. This is pulled back quite a bit. Go back up here, focus on the background, come back down to the bird, try zone. Oh, zone's not working so, oh, there, it finally, I'm pumping it. Finds the leaf out front. Go back up, come back down to the bird, put it right in the center, hit spot. And that's really what you need to do. This is where people, I think, try to rely on eye detection all the time or zone all the time. When you've got something back in a bush like this and you're trying to get on this bird, tell the autofocus what your subject is by using spot. That's why I have spot on my third far right autofocus back button always. Once you've basically told the autofocus what your subject is, now it puts the white box on there, and now you can go to eye detection and it's going to track that eye. Okay? You can go to zone. It'll track the eye within the zone only. But you tell the autofocus system what your subject is in these kinds of situations where it's an obscured subject in low light, having a hard time to find it with eye detection right off the bat. So we're going to go through it one more time. This is what I generally do in these situations. You're completely defocused. You see a bird. There it is. You don't go to eye detection immediately. You don't go to zone immediately. You move your thumb over to the button, whatever button you have set up for spot, and it finds that bird. Now it even sees the eye of the bird once you told it what it is. Now if you want to switch to eye detection, you can do it. Or if you want to switch to zone and only track within the zone, you can do it. That's the process for these types of scenarios, but the overall message here is that spot works better, zone works better, eye detection works better, it's more refined. This is at 200 millimeters. Let's zoom in. I've got a 2:8. Why have this bird so small in the frame? Oh, look at that. We zoom in on this bird. Now it finds the eye. Eye detection, got it. Zone, eye detection, got it. Spot, got it. There you go. All right. Very refined autofocus system. Moving up to this bird, completely out of focus. Do we dare try to go directly to eye detection or zone? That'd be risky. Why not tell it what you want with spot? Spot. Oh, that's what your subject is? Oh, now I can find the eye. Now I can track it. Oh, now I can go to zone. Oh, I can track it throughout the zone. Goes out of the zone, it's still tracking it, but it's just not focusing on it. But there you go. That's how I shoot with 3 back buttons on a static type scenario. We're going to do some birds in flight. This is going to be more challenging having to shoot looking at the recorder, but we can see some of the similar things going on. And we're also going to try the test for, dual pixel autofocus has issues with vertical elements, really being a magnet to those, and having like a bird or something behind some grass and trying to get on those. We'll see if this autofocus system does better there. But hey, give this autofocus a chance by doing things what I consider in the right order, and I'll tell you what, it is pretty darn amazing. Okay, so now we have a different setup where we have vertical elements. This is something that used to drive me crazy, and maybe it still will with the R5 Mark II, but with the R5 and even the R3, dual pixel autofocus loves vertical elements. It's like a magnet. I'm going to use my autofocus on button, which is going to use the zone, and I've got vertical elements set up in the foreground with a bird behind it. Okay, and you can already see it wants to go to the bird, but I want to see if it's going to just jump. Use the autofocus on button with the zone and see if it just jumps right to that verticalish element. And it does. See? This is dual pixel. The R1 has quad pixel or cross type autofocus. I'm wondering if it does a lot better. But let's see if it finds the bird. It loves those vertical elements. See that? So now let's go over to the bird and hit zone, and it goes to the vertical element. Let's go completely out of focus to the background, come in. There's a vertical element in the foreground here. Boy, just loves that, doesn't it? That's dual pixel autofocus. That's the Canon R5 Mk II still doing that. Let's see. It just does, look, it's sticking. There's two things going on here. The vertical elements are closer and they're vertical-ish. Vertical-ish, is that a word? I don't know. But anyway, they're pretty much vertical things. Bending a little bit. It likes that. Doesn't go to the eye of the bird. Doesn't go to the body of the bird. Now, the body of the bird's there, and we can see it. So let's go to spot. This is one of those things. It's kind of the solution to get started. Tell the autofocus what your subject is, if you can. Spot. Boom. Goes right to the bird. Then it finds the eye. See that square around the eye? Now we can go to eye detection. Does it stay on the eye? It does. We'll go to zone. Does it stay on the eye within the zone? It does. Will it jump to vertical stuff? Come back. Goes right back to the eye. Go completely out of focus. Come back. Let's try the zone. Hey, ooh, it almost went. Nope, it's going to the vertical stuff. It almost went to the bird. The solution here, spot, then eye detection and zone, or just spot and stay on spot. It's going to the eye because I have eye detection set to auto, so if the eye is there, it's going to go there. But it still really likes, the autofocus system of the R5 Mk II still really likes vertical stuff. Look at how it's just going to those like crazy. And then you come over here and goes to that vertical stem off to the right rather than the eye of the bird if we're using zone with eye detection or if we use eye detection. That was eye detection. Oop, it went to the eye that time. Now granted, that vertical element is going right up close to the eye. Let's try it and see what it does if the vertical element isn't right by the eye. Okay, so now you'll see in a second here that the element, that vertical element, is not right on the eye. Nothing's in focus now. Let's just try and see. We'll go to the vertical element first. Does it want it? Does it want it? Yep. Look at that. Okay. But now let's bring it over by the bird's eye. It's almost in focus-ish. Nope, but not. Oh, there, it found it. It found it. That zone, that's autofocus on button. It found it with that vertical element going off to the left more. Let's try that again. Let's go over here. Let's go defocusing. Bring it back. Oh, it goes right to the eye of the bird. Look at that. With it, if that vertical element isn't so close, it likes the eye now. It doesn't go to those vertical elements within the zone. Let's defocus. Come back over and just try eye detection. Goes right to the eye of the bird there, wide out, open. Again, this is low light. Okay, this is low light. So it's doing a lot better there. This is an improvement again, I think. I think it is a definite refinement over what I see with the R5 and the R3. It likes the vertical element, likes the vertical element. There's an eye in there. Oh, it found it, and there we go. Wow, okay. These are vertical, relatively vertical elements in the foreground, which is closer, and that's what autofocuses look for, closer stuff, with the eye of a bird behind it, and it's liking the eye as long as that vertical element isn't right there by the eye. I don't know, what do you think? I think it's a definite improvement. And the other thing to notice here is we can become way out of focus. Come over, you see the bird's head in there. And as long as the eye, unlike the other scenario we just did where the eye was very obscured and the overall bird was very obscured, now the bird is more obvious to the autofocus system. You can go right to the zone eye detection and it grabs it, you can go right to eye detection, overall, frame or overall screen tracking. It finds it. So you don't even have to go to spot first in this case. Should I say it again? Should I repeat one more time? I really think what we're seeing here is a definite refinement of the autofocus system in the R5 Mark II over the R3 and the R5. And even though this is still dual pixel autofocus, I think it's doing a better job with these vertical elements. Of course, it's still going to be a challenge until we get completely away from dual pixel and into quad pixel. We'll see how the R1 does. But I'm encouraged. Hopefully you are too. All that being said, the autofocus system in the R5 Mark II is the best autofocus system I've used. I've used an A1, I've used a Z9, the Z8 now, and it's the best I've used. It's the most intuitive to use and set up that I've used. And now we're going to try birds in flight and see how that goes. Now if we can just get some birds to fly, show you how the autofocus system of the R5 Mark II works on flying birds, how I've got it set up. 3 back button autofocus. Autofocus on being my zone, asterisk button being eye detection, and then of course the far right button being spot. Spot doesn't come into play much, birds in flight. Boom. Hey, got ourselves a fish. How about that? There you go. Boom, eye detection. Boom, zone. Zone should do well here because it's looking for wing beats and everything else. If I can keep it on the bird. That was me not keeping the bird in the zone. Switch to eye detection as it gets close throughout the entire frame. Yeah, I'll take that. Follow that bird. Oh, he went over there. He's feeding its mate, maybe. Eye detection, switch over. Look at that. Stays right with the bird. Right against that water. Against backgrounds. Against everything as it goes off. Nice. Gull coming in. Zone. Keep it in the zone. Oh, it went right behind a bird now. Oop, but it did pick up on the same bird when it came out from behind the other bird. See? What's it doing? Identifying the bird I was on? I have no idea. I don't think it's doing that. Stick, 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 stick to the bird, stick to the bird, stick to the bird. Look at that. Yep. Amongst all those birds down there. Boom, right on the gull. That wasn't too bad, right? Whee! So much fun looking at the back of the recorder. But you can see it's pretty darn sticky on this bird. And I'm not even really keeping it in the zone the way I should. Go to eye detection, that kind of thing. Here comes an osprey. Let's see. Ooh! Things never do what you want them to when you want them to do it. So there's another example going past other birds and things. Staying right on that bird all the way in, see. Here comes a snowy. Stayed on that pretty well. Get on that. There we go. Bring it up a little bit. One-legged gull. Well, back in from the field again, trying to get some flight shots showing the behavior of the autofocus system of the Canon R5 Mark II. I really didn't get what I was hoping to get, and that was birds flying along and then going behind some trees and then popping out again, and showing you that the autofocus system of this camera tends to stay locked on the bird, doesn't jump real quick to interfering objects. Instead, I got a lot of birds flying around against blue sky, cloudy sky, then back to, against backgrounds of bushes and then water and all that kind of stuff. And I think you could see that I was switching back and forth between zone and eye detection, the two back buttons there. It was pretty sticky on the bird, and I think it is a refinement again over what you see as far as behavior. Same setup in the R3 and the R5. Overall, I'm really happy with it. So, yeah, not much else I can say or show you with respect to how the autofocus behaves. Now, I didn't switch back and forth between settings. I kept the settings the same to keep this simple. In the video, you saw what I had set up, so now you can see the behavior that's related to that. I hope it's helpful in some ways. If you have any questions, if you set things up different, put them down in the comments, email me, whatever you like to do. Yeah. So, with that, there's really not much else to talk about. Hey, until next time, I hope you're having great light. I hope you're getting great images. Be safe out there. I'll see you soon.